Good afternoon, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Pegram students at SBS and SBS for inviting us. Giovanna and I have enjoyed doing this for the last 4 years, 5 years now, I think, and it's been wonderful engaging with you all. So, I am going to weave a few stories together and hopefully make sense. I want to bring up a few questions, some of the same questions, but worded slightly differently from the ones that Giovanna brought up. Does the study of material and visual culture matter to those outside the humanities? Yeah? Can objects tell the story of global trade, exchange, and change? How do objects connect us, all of us in this particular room? Is it important to recognize and study connections between what seem like socially and culturally different people? What could a 17th century motif or design teach us about brands and the impact of design on business? Yes, so several questions over here for you to ponder on as we go through the next 20 minutes or so. To begin with, I am going to quote somebody from the 19th century. This is 19th century British India. India at that particular time was Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, altogether South Asia, under the British. And there's a particular individual called Nawab Imad Nawaz Jung, a Muslim man in what is today Lahore. And this is what he says. And this is a period where British India is talking about education for women. Interesting, we're talking about women, right? Today, especially since the glass ceiling still hasn't been broken. Those who oppose women's education or who want to make efforts to restrict women's proficiency to a few religious texts, or those groups who think that nature, compared to men, has endowed women with incomplete faculties, all of them must reform their misunderstandings by the life story of Noor Jahan, unquote. Yeah? So who is Noor Jahan? Well, Noor Jahan was an immigrant in what is India today. She was, or her parents were, of Persian descent, so they came from Iran, they traveled to India, and Noor Jahan was born on the way. So she's born in what was then, on today, Afghanistan. She grows up in India, and we find that her parents, and especially her father, very quickly gets a job in the Mughal court, the emperor's court in India. Noor Jahan grows up reading and writing Persian. Persian is the important court language of that particular period in India. And like most young girls and boys, once they reach maturity, she is married. She's married off very young to a young boy of approximately her age. They're both mature, and you find that she's married. She goes on to have a child with this man, but at the very young age of 30, she is widowed, right? And this is approximately 1607. So she's a single mother then, with one child, a daughter, and we find her story somewhat begins, the second part of her story, in a bazaar, in the Delhi bazaar, selling embroidered textiles. It seems like this mother, single mother, probably had to provide for her child and herself. And in this bazaar, selling those embroidered textiles made by her, she meets her second husband, okay? And who is her second husband? Her second husband happens to be the then Emperor of India, right? And so this is Emperor Jahangir. She meets him and becomes, in 1611, his 18th wife. And we all laugh. Why? Because tough. Huh? Wife number 18. That means she has 17 other wives above her. If there's a pyramid in the Zenana, which is the inner palace for the women, 17 other wives, probably mostly younger than her, almost all of them Indian, whereas she's an immigrant. Yeah? And it's not just the wives, there are probably all those mothers, the stepmothers of the previous emperor, grandmothers who may have been very, very young as well, right? So and the sisters, unmarried sisters, daughters, etc. So a very large pyramid in this particular inner palace, the Zanana. And wife number 18 would have fallen right at the top or bottom? Bottom, yeah? So wife would have been at the bottom at the age of 34. And yet, in just a few years, we find out that she is the power behind the throne. How does she achieve this? Well, to tell you how she achieved this is another story, which maybe another day I can come back and we can discuss that. But long story short, she becomes the power behind the throne. Right? And as she becomes the power behind the throne, between 1611 and 1627, her family rises as well. So the network becomes really important. Power clearly is associated here with her network. Some nepotism here as well. Clearly she's protecting herself. But father, brother, her niece, she arranges a marriage between her stepson and her niece. So the stepson who's going to become the next emperor. So this is looking forward as well. Yes? What are her interests? Well, she can read and write Persian. She writes Persian poetry. Persian is the language of the court, perhaps one of the reasons why she is the power behind the throne, because it is the language of the court. It is the official language of the court. And she writes in Persian. We find that she's a patron of the arts. She has her own guilds, her own painters. Certainly, there is an early portrait here of the emperor. You can see him seated here with his with his son, her stepson, who is going to become the next emperor, and she, as well as other women from the Zanana. She has great interest in architecture. One of the early structures that she is a patron of is this particular marble tomb in India. It is the first royal marble tomb in India. Normally, when we think of India and we think marble tombs, we're thinking of something different. This comes before that particular tomb, right? And this particular tomb, if you were to enter it, it is these images, these people on the screen here, they give you some sense of scale over here. The other tomb that you're all thinking about is much larger than this, yet this is the first one. The details on the walls of this particular tomb, which is set in a garden, is inlaid with colored stones. It is carved beautifully, as you see over here, painted as well. I mean, if you look at a close-up of this detail here, the ceiling almost looks like lace over here. It looks light, and yet it's made out of marble, right? Heavy stone over here. So a great eye as far as detail is concerned where the queen was concerned. Some close-ups of the inlay as well as painted details of the walls. You can see a particular motif here. The motif, garden motifs come into fashion in her particular time, and especially motifs such as these that represent cypress trees, right? Influence, yes, the structure that you're all thinking about in the same city of Agra. So this is a map of Agra. This is where this particular tomb is built. It's a tomb built for her parents, and across the river in the same city, the other tomb that you're all thinking about, right? This particular tomb was built by her stepson, who was married to her niece, and it is in memory of her niece that he goes on to build the Taj Mahal. A great, great structure, but clearly this came before the other one. She has great interest in landscape architecture as well. In her time, we see some beautiful gardens that are landscaped in India. Many of them don't survive anymore, but some of them still do, especially in the northern state of Kashmir. We have gardens that were used not just by the royals, but the public as well, before 1627. And when you think about, the great public garden in London is not open to the general public until 1637, so years later, right? So that's something to keep in mind here. Just a few views of some of the gardens that still are in existence from her particular period. Absolutely ethereal, wonderful, paradise-like spaces. Now, her interests, of course, also go into trade. right? And she has coins that are struck in her name. And we are informed about her by a particular individual called Thomas Rowe. Thomas Rowe, he tells us about her gardens. He tells us that she is the Empress Trader. But who is Thomas Rowe? Does anybody know who Thomas Rowe is, or have you heard that name before? Well, is anybody here from Magdalen College? No, but at least one from Magdalen College. So he was a student from Magdalen College, who then goes on to become a diplomat of his time, and a diplomat in the time of both Elizabeth, James I, and then later as well. He's the first ambassador from the English court to the Mughal court, and he certainly is in Emperor Jahangir, Nur Jahan's husband's court between 1615 and 1618. Right? So he tells us a great deal about her. But what is interesting is that in the first 2 years that he is there in India, he is focused on all the men in the court, not realizing that wife number 18 holds the power, right? And that he needs to approach this woman or try to meet her. She does meet ambassadors, she does meet people, even though she maintains parda, she maintains the veil. She communicates through her ministers and servants, but what we do understand is that even though when Rowe realizes that he should have met with Nur Jahan, it is perhaps too late before he returns, but he gives us a great deal of information, and it's perhaps too late to get an appointment with her. He mentions that she is Empress Trader. He tells us that she owns her own ships. He tells us that she has monopoly over several things, especially indigo, a color, blue, that comes from a plant in the subcontinent, and embroidered textiles. He himself is interested, where England is concerned, in textiles from India. Right? So that's the interest of the English court. We are told that she is Empress Trader, especially where trading with the Middle East and Egypt is concerned. So something about now textiles that he was interested in, and that she clearly has a monopoly over as far as India is concerned. Where India is concerned, we can go back as far back as 5,000 years ago. India is the cradle of cotton textiles, and perhaps even further back from then. And clearly today, when we think of Indian textiles, especially cotton, perhaps we think about cheap material. We think about colors that run, etc. So clearly something happened in the mid-19th century that the textiles became cheaper. But at one point, the world desired textiles from India, right? All kinds of textiles, especially cotton, and another one that I'm going to talk about. But you can see the various colors here represented in the 17th and 18th century paintings, and how these were used, not just as clothing, but also as furnishing, right? These are the kind of textiles, whether for tents or literally to make tents of this kind. So this particular tent, it uses all the shiny material that you see on this is gold. It's literally gold, 24 karat gold, that has been strung around a cord that is silk, and then that particular gold thread is then used to embroider what you see on this 17th century tent, right? It's absolutely fabulous silk tent over here. It could also be something in cotton, something very similar, but fabulous textiles used in this way. This particular textile is a part of the Ashmolean's collection. It's hand-painted. So these kind of textiles were very, very popular, especially in France and in England. There are small little workshops in India that still exist that do the similar kind of work, hand-painted textiles or block-printed textiles. In that particular period, block printing was really mass production in some ways. But hand-printed textiles such as these in the 17th, 18th century, what could they have been used for in Europe? How would one use these in Europe? Well, you could use it for your walls, literally. Put them on your walls, or for your beds, right? And the canopies. Or literally both, right? And clearly it's this kind of textiles and motifs from these kind of textiles that are going to influence wallpaper. Right? So the connection over here is something to think about as well. But these textiles are clearly going to be textiles, especially cotton textile, where dresses are concerned, right? And so it is a luxury product at this particular point. I do want you to note this, right here, this motif here. I'm going to come back to it a little bit later. But textiles from this, you can see in especially 17th century paintings, are being used by seamstresses in England as well as in France. This is in France, where they're creating not just dresses for themselves, but also for women in society, right? And you can see here an absolutely fabulous portrait of textiles that are being created into fashionable gowns for high society in France. Jackets, gowns, furnishing, etc. Clearly a particular material that is greatly desired, which means demand is going to rise, right? So if demand rises and this particular material, this luxury material is expensive to bring all the way on ships from India to Europe, what does one do? What does one do? One tries to make it cheaper, right? But how is one going to make it cheaper? Well, the raw material also comes from India. That's still expensive. It means that we're going to try and make it somewhere closer. Is it going to be possible to grow cotton in France and in England? No, right? So where are we going to grow it? Well, Egypt is still far away, right? We want to grow it on quote-unquote home ground. So it's really cheap, which means the southern states of America. Right? We're going to think about the colonies. And so we are going to start thinking about the colonies, and that's where cotton is going to come from. We're going to try and create these textiles at home, including painting these as well. But the painting of these textiles initially is going to mean that we're not experts in Europe, and so our textiles are going to run, the colors are going to run. Right? And so migrant expertise is brought from the subcontinent and Central Asia to teach people in Europe on how to create these fantastic textiles. And once we are able to create fantastic similar textiles, there will be a ban on things that come from India. That's something to keep in mind as expertise grows over here. Okay, so cheaper means of production is going to mean growing it on cotton plantations. And even though I'm not going to go into these particular points, think about the links over here. Growing it in cotton plantations in the southern states of America is going to have an influence on other kinds of trade, right? It means increase in slave trade. It means indentured labor. It means an effect on Africa, India, China, etc. Right? And the same thing that you're thinking about cotton, you can also apply to things like tea and sugar. Right? So this is sugar, for example, Brazil is something to think about, and the very similar patterns that we're going to see there as well. So cotton is one part of the story. The other part of the story is Pashmina. Okay? Pashmina, when I say Pashmina, I'm not talking about the Pashmina that you buy for 15 pounds on High Street. Right? They call it Pashmina, but that's mixed textile. Right? Pashmina was a luxury product that came from India in this very early period, and it is specifically, when we say Pashmina, we mean a shawl here. The word shal comes from the Persian language, anglicized to shawl over here, worn both unisex here, male and women would wear it over their shoulders or around their waist like a belt, and it is greatly traded to Europe, the Middle East, Egypt, etc. There are interests as far as Lou Jahan is concerned. She's interested in embroidery. Clearly, we know that the second part of her story, the important part of her story, starts with her selling those embroidered textiles in the market. She's interested in embroidery, brocade, lace, so on and so forth. And there is a connection between, remember those motifs that we saw on the walls of her tomb dedicated to her parents, that kind of flower and plant motif is going to appear in textiles as well. right? We understand the oral tradition is very strong, and it tells us that both her mother and she had these interests, and perhaps this is something that she learned from her mother. What is very interesting is that the mother, since she comes from Persia, there's a particular motif called buta. It's spelt in various ways, buta, bute, booty, either way. Buta is a particular motif that is in the form or shape of a pine cone. A pine cone or a leaf or a cypress. Remember the cypress tree that you saw in the tomb. So it is this particular form with the little tip that goes up in that particular way. Right here, these. And so that is the form that's called buta, the outline. And we find that the design of the buta combined with various colors. So when you think India, clearly many of us think colors, right? This combination of colors and that outline of the motif gives us something that looks like this, right? These are the various buta motifs that developed 17th, 18th, and so on centuries. And we find something of this kind as well. This is, again, an object from the Ashmolean, which is a very small part of what would have been the border of a shawl. Okay, so this is probably just a third of what would have been a border in a Pashmina shawl. Now, this is a man that perhaps some of you recognize. Any ideas? Did I hear a name? Napoleon. Napoleon. So Napoleon suddenly enters our story here. So 1800, we know Napoleon is in Egypt. And interesting, Giovanna mentioned gifts, especially diplomatic gifts. And diplomatic gifts, many a times in this particular world, include textiles, luxury textiles, right? So it is quite possible that he could have been given a shawl, because shawl was both for a man and for a woman. Now, this light, beautiful material is something that he probably sent to his wife. We know he sent it to her because she writes about it in a letter. Okay, and she tells us that she's received these gifts from him, colorful shawls, very expensive material, and very light. Eventually, she grows to love these. Apparently, a few years after she received that gift, according to some sources, she paid for one shawl 20,000 gold francs. So that tells you how expensive this particular material and object was, right? And these are images of Josephine. In every single portrait that she sits, other than the portrait where she's being crowned queen or in her royal regalia, she is seen with shawls around her. And these are the Pashmina shawls, shawls that are woven with the buta motif at the bottom. And so we see not just her, but now that she, the fashionista of her time, just like Nur Jahan probably was a fashionista of her time, in her place, there are going to be women in the French court who are going to start to emulate Josephine. And so Josephine is going to change the fashions in the early 19th century in France. Women are going to copy her style. It will become a wearable status symbol. Because as you look at these portraits are all of very well-to-do, high society women who could have worn expensive jewels, but what are they all wearing? What are they showing? They're showing that particular shawl, which costs an immense bundle. And that is clearly a status symbol as far as they are concerned. And it's not just France, but Germany, Russia, England, all across Europe. You start to see these elite women appear with the Pashmina shawl. And how do we know that they are Pashminas? Because note the borders. The borders all have that motif, which is almost like a brand, right? A recognizable motif on these particular shawls that tell us these are the Pashmina shawls. Not only does she wear the shawl, but she starts to cut the border and put it on her gowns. So it becomes part of the outfit as well. Once she starts to do it, others in Europe are going to do it as well, right? So she's really changing fashions in her particular time. So there again, the Bhuta then therefore becomes, we recognize that these portraits have Pashmina shawls on them because of the Bhuta motif on it. Now, when I say Pashmina, I am sure by now most of you have realized I'm talking about cashmere, right? This is not a real Pashmina shawl. It is cashmere, but it's not the Pashmina shawl because it doesn't have the motif on it, right? And so woven together, this particular Pashmina shawl becomes the heart of that kind of business. We are going to see demand rise as well now that everybody, especially high society and those who can afford it, want it. So what do? A very similar story like the cotton trade, right? We try and make it ourselves. But if we try to make it ourselves, it means we need to domesticate the Pashmina goat, which is a goat that comes from the Himalayan range. Are we going to do that? Yes, we are. Thousands of goats are going to be brought. Many of them are going to die. But eventually they will survive, and you know that we can now get this kind of material in certain parts of Europe. But besides the Pashmina or the cashmere wool, Pashmina comes from Kashmir or Kashmir, and therefore the link there. We can also use wool, just sheep wool, plenty of it in Scotland, right? And that is clearly what we are going to do. So the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s is going to use wool from these sheep in especially a place called Paisley, right? And now you see, some of you are smiling, especially the women, I can see, that this link between Bhuta and Paisley, right? But we are calling it Paisley because of the place in Scotland where these shawls made out of wool are being created with machines. Complicated and multicolored patterns can be created. And that means upper and middle class women can now wear it and own it. It's cheaper. It's affordable to everybody, irrespective of class now, right? Machine-made multicolored fabrics such as this particular material here will mean that what was once a shawl can now be the fabric. So with changing fashions, it means that you can, the fashion can change and it could now be a coat, but the coat can still continue to use that kind of material, right? And once everybody can have it, working class as well, there is a particular class that started it all that doesn't want it anymore, right? Why? Because it's become too common, right? Do they not want the cashmere? Or do they not want the Pashmina shawl? Well, the cashmere is still desired. As you know, when we go into the market, cashmere is still expensive. The cashmere is desired, but they don't want that motif anymore on it because the motif has now been associated with something common, right? And so it means that we have to wait another 100 years before 4 working class boys can go to India, come back wearing these kind of wonderful shirts with the Bhuta motif on it for high fashion to accept it again, right? And then, of course, once it becomes part of textiles, not just Pashmina, but cotton and silk and so on and so forth, fashion industry has continued to use the Bhuta motif, but it has been separated from the cashmere shawls, right? And that is the story of the Bhuta, cashmere, and the fashionistas of their time and our time as well. Okay, that's it. Questions from you?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for coming and for your keen questions. It's clear from the work that Mallica and Giovanna do and represent that thinking about objects and thinking about art also allows us to think about value and commerce and other things that we think about in the business school in different ways, but are now enriched by this added perspective. Thank you both.
Pleasure.